For most players, when the term rework is thrown around, it's usually applied within the context of the modern day. Roughly around mid-season 4 is when Riot decided to put more time and effort not only into reimagining new champions but giving more exposure to them. Champion spotlights have been a mainstay for the League of Legends official YouTube channel since day one, but it wasn't until the advent of Sion's full overhaul when visual gameplay updates, or VGUs, were pushed to the forefront of discussion. It also just happens to be around the time when their thumbnail title switched from a brass gold color to an aqua blue. Despite prevailing wisdom, reworks have been taking place for many years, perhaps not to the same overwhelming extent as the likes of what we see today, but even so nonetheless, it's just that they weren't given high-profile attention. One such champion who received a rather significant update was Karma, whose rework took place early Season 3, at a time when such updates were rather uncommon. One would go so far as to say she was the true first major visual gameplay update in the game, since the Karma we know today is a stark contrast to the iteration that was around during the game's infancy. From what I can tell, she was Riot's first attempt at a complete reimagination, as up until that point, Riot's many reworks were mostly gameplay adjustments. He still maintained Overload, Rune Prison, and Spellflux the entire time, just with variations in properties. In other words, she was the first major rework in League's history, so it's time that we meditate on Karma's rework, a retrospective. So while we're on the subject of types of reworks, we need to first understand the difference between them. Rework is an umbrella term used to simply describe a champion receiving adjustments to their abilities that go beyond the scope of numbers, enough to where both the person piloting that champion and their opponents have to be aware that said ability does not have the same properties as what came before. An example of this would be Darius. His old decimate used to be an immediate cast, effectively making it impossible to react to, but it also didn't heal off of champions. Obviously, the ability in essence remains unchanged. It has a sweet spot and a sour spot, requiring the player to space the attack carefully for optimal results. But since there's now a delay to it, it offers different interactions between Darius and his opponent. This is what's known as a gameplay update. The champion in question maintains their original kit and visuals, but with a slight change to things. A visual gameplay update, also known as a full relaunch, totally reimagines the subject, to the point where their original and new versions are like comparing apples to oranges. Perhaps there might be one or two things that are largely the same, but all aspects from interactions to base properties to roles and matchups do not carry from one to the other, and those types of reworks are what this series is all about. Karma's playstyle and composition were roughly the same, give or take. She had 3 abilities with a base form and an empowered form. By the way, this is an unrelated note, but I like to make a formal apology for forgetting to include her in my empowered abilities video. I have no idea why she never crossed my mind while making that episode, but all the same, I'm sorry for that error. It was a pretty egregious one. Anyways, while her whole gimmick was to make careful use of her mantra, the basic abilities themselves function very differently from the Q, W, and E we're familiar with today. To start, given that she was conceived very early on in League's history, her passive was, like many others at the time, a very simple one. Inner Flame would grant her bonus ability power based on her missing health. So it was, for all intents and purposes, Olaf's passive, except you swapped out the attack speed with AP. This was very uncharacteristic to see on a mage. Generally speaking, the goal of a ranged champion, irrespective of if they're an auto attacker like a marksman or a caster like a mage, is to avoid taking damage as much as possible in light of their lower survivability and resilience compared to melees. If you're playing a ranged champion, you're expected to die a lot less than melees, otherwise you're doing something terribly wrong. So a passive that incentivizes the player to remain at low health seems pretty counterintuitive for a mage. Let's move on. Her Q was Heavenly Flame. Instead of a bolt of energy in a straight line that explodes on contact, Karma's old Q was a lot like Annie's Q, damaging all enemies in a cone in front of her. In fact, it wasn't even energy, she threw what appears to be shurikens. Mantra's empowerment also caused Heavenly Wave to heal Karma and all allies in the cone based on their missing health. To her credit, while it seemed pretty risky to maximize the AP bonus from Inner Flame, she had built-in sustain which grew stronger not only from being at low health, but from how much ability power she had, which she would get a lot of from being at low health. Otherwise, it was your Garden Variety obligatory damage spell. Her W was Spirit Bond. She created a tether between herself and a target ally or enemy for up to 5 seconds, so while the current version can only tether to enemies, this one lets you choose between friend or foe. If she tethered to an ally, both of them would gain bonus movement speed, and anyone who went between the two of you would gain the movement speed modifier for 3 seconds. Allies would be sped up, enemies would be slowed. Speaking of enemy, if she formed a tether with an opponent, they would take magic damage and be slowed while affected. Mantra's empowerment simply doubled the movement speed modifier, so it would speed up allies faster and slow enemies harder. Just by looking at the text on screen, one might think this ability is underwhelming. But with proper coordination, Mantra's Spirit Bond was basically Sivir's ultimate if everyone stayed near the tether. Pretty interesting interaction to say the least. It was an aura effect built into a continuously activated ability. Then we have Soul Shield, which is more or less the same as their current one fundamentally speaking. A big shield on herself or someone else, except it didn't speed you up. Mantra's empowerment was quite different though. On cast, the soul shield would project a burst of energy, inflicting the shield's amount as damage to all enemies on cast. What's curious about Karma's abilities compared to that of Renekton, Rumble, Rengar and such was that her Q, W, and E had something that could potentially help the team and or harm the enemy team. Heavenly Wave damaged enemies and healed allies. Spirit Bond sped up allies and slowed enemies. Soul Shield protected allies and damaged enemies. Technically, it was possible to achieve both simultaneously, but given how volatile League is in any given match, the premise was you had to choose between which one you wanted to do, not unlike that of Lulu's W and E. In a lot of ways, Karma had a decently well-rounded kit with a clear objective. Yes, the abilities were very one-dimensional in nature, but the skill expression came from knowing what needed to be used at what time. Should you use Heavenly Wave on your injured team to give them a massive heal, or should you use it for damage on your opponents? Do you use Spirit Bond to boost your own team's tempo or slow down enemies? Do you use Soul Shield on your ADC who's being dove by an assassin, or on your J4 who managed to trap the enemy backline in his Cataclysm? The duality of her abilities was her appeal. So what was wrong with her design? The answer is nothing really in particular. All of her problems were relative. Though she was one of the first, enchanters at the time were very cookie cutter. There wasn't that much separating the likes of Sona from Soraka or Karma from Lulu. At the end of the day, what distinguished one from another was what they did on top of the shields and or heals they provided. And that's where just about everyone had her beat. Janna's Howling Gale and Monsoon provided her with very effective ways to disengage incoming threats, making her the premier choice for defensive support. Sona was very well loved for consistently augmenting her team's tempo thanks to Song of Celerity, not to mention Crescendo, a fantastic teamfight ultimate at the time. Lulu was kind of in the middle. She was excellent at juicing up her teammates and disrupting opponents thanks to Whimsy and Wild Growth. Karma's claim to fame was damage. Her passive gave her a lot of free damage, and Heavenly Wave, Spirit Bond, and Soul Shield were all potential sources of damage. Very high amounts of damage at that. If she layered the offensive aspect of each on a single target, it would sting just as hard as a full trade combo from any other mage. Therein lies the problem. Karma's individual components, while applicable in many circumstances, were not enough to fulfill what was demanded of her at the time. Without Mantra, her abilities were abhorrently underwhelming. Q was just damage in an area, nothing else. W at base rank was a 10% movement speed or a 10% slow, barely anything. And lest we forget, tethers can be broken if you stray too far from each other. Soul Shield was a regular shield, no movement speed, nothing else attached to it. Mantra was both the source of her strength and the only way she could function. But even then, her Mantra-empowered abilities did little to increase her combat pressure in a fight. For example, Empowered Spirit Bond simply made the speed up or slow down stronger. Movement speed is important, but it needs a supplemental element to really capitalize on it. Slowing an enemy by 40% isn't all that much more problematic than 20%. By and large, they're slowed enough for you to be faster than them. As for the supplemental element, there was none. The slow didn't make it easier to land Heavenly Wave, nor did it interact with Soul Shield. That's what it boiled down to. Karma was just weak. She didn't do enough either as mage or support, a very bare bones enchanter. She was easily overshadowed by the likes of Janna, Lulu, Nami, and Sona when it came to ally protection, and stood little chance against the true dedicated mages like Annie, Orianna, Vladimir, and Rice. Initially, she was supposed to make up for that by being a mage who can support her team or support who can deal good damage, but when it comes to League, it's always better to be excellent at one job instead of passable at two. I mean, obviously you want to be excellent at two jobs if you could, but if only one was allowed, it's always better to choose the former, and that's what players did. They would rather have a dedicated support or a dedicated mage as opposed to a jack of all trades. Now, the idea of her different interactions based on friend or foe was a solid one. The foundation was set in place, there just needed to be a bit more oomph, better allocation of her properties, and possibly a little bit more. So the focal point of her rework was exactly that. Make her mantra do something more substantial for each of her abilities and to distribute her power budget more efficiently. Not only has their base kit been enhanced to be usable even without their empowered forms, but mantra's effects dramatically increased the potency of each one. They first did away with their old Inner Flame passive entirely, which was a smart choice. Despite being able to heal herself, having to stay at low HP was counterintuitive no matter how you sliced it. Gathering Fire took its place, reducing her mantra cooldown whenever hitting champions with damaging abilities. Now, at the time of this recording, it only applies to abilities, but back then it also applied to basic attacks as well. Her new passive rewarded players for engaging in combat with their opponents as frequently as possible by granting access to more uses of mantra. Heavenly Flame was supplanted with Inner Flame, sharing the same name as her old passive. No longer a cone, it's now a skill shot in a straight line that explodes on the first enemy hit, damaging and slowing anyone caught in it. So what they did was take the slow from a Spirit Bond and attach it to her Q, which helps a lot for slowing down fleeing enemies or kiting pursuers. Speaking of Spirit Bond, it's been changed to Focus Resolve. It has the same tether-based property, but it can now only be used on enemies. If the tether lasts for 2 seconds without breaking, it damages the target again and roots them in place. Finally, Karma has crowd control. She used to be the only enchanter with no hard CC in her kit, now she has one. It's not much, but it gets the job done, and with the slow being moved to her Q, she still has a way to bog her opponent's tempo enough to ensure the root. But what about the movement speed boost her allies? That was brought to her new shield, Inspire. Just like Soul Shield, she can use it on herself or a target ally champion, but now it grants 40% bonus movement speed. All in all, new Karma's base kit was noticeably buffed in terms of usability and versatility, and Mantra's properties would accentuate them even further. The empowered versions received new names for one. Inner Flame enhanced with Mantra became Soul Flare, significantly increasing its base damage to the point where just the initial blast has a base damage of almost 500 at max rank. But it also left behind a slowing field that would aftershock for further damage. If you took both hits, Soul Flare could easily do over 1000 damage in the late game, not something to be trifled with. In essence, old Karma's high damage was consolidated into her empowered Q. Mantra Empowered Focus Resolve became Renewal, instantly restoring a large portion of Karma's missing health on cast, and once more if the tether completed its full duration. 40% plus 2 per 100% AP missing health, arguably the largest single healing ability in the game. On top of that, the root duration would extend as well, locking someone in place for over 3 seconds at max rank. Karma lost the ability to rejuvenate her allies, but now gained one of the best single target lockdown and combat healing tools in the game, well worth the trade-off. Mantra Empowered Inspire became Defiance, increasing the shield's strength on the initial target and spreading a portion of that shield and movement speed bonus to all allies around that target. So instead of damaging enemies, she can now theoretically shield all 5 members of her team. Now we're talking numbers there. As far as making her individual abilities feel more impactful at base and with Mantra goes, Riot succeeded. There's now a tangible sense of skill expression in knowing which empowered ability she should use at what time. High damage, strong survivability, and lockdown or party-wide shields. These changes were enough to catapult her out of mediocrity and into widespread usability. While it's true that she's still not on par with a dedicated support or a dedicated mage, she's around 80% competent at both now compared to 60%. Historically, Karma's been a consistent presence in the metagame due to her versatility. Her above-average damage output for an enchanter makes her viable in solo lanes because none of her abilities require the presence of another ally to be used to their full effect, and her strong neutral game makes her pretty annoying to deal with in bot lane, considering she does just as much damage as her ADC, if not more early on. However, since she's only 80% of either role, Karma does fall off late game to some degree, but that's part and parcel for any champion with empowered abilities. Rumble, Renekton, Rengar, Pantheon, Karma, and Heimerdinger are quite strong early and mid game, but they'll never be able to access 100% of their power at all times because that's how empowered abilities work. Karma has to choose which one will yield the most results at what time. Objectively, her rework was a phenomenal success, no one can dispute that. Old Karma would never be able to survive in the current environment of League. Unfortunately, it came at the cost of losing that duality that she was known for. All 3 of her previous iterations' attacks could simultaneously assist her allies and hinder her enemies in some way, shape, or form. That's now gone. Inner Flame and Soul Flare are strictly for enemies. Focus Resolve and Renewal are strictly for enemies. She has to heal, but you can't tether this to your ally to heal them, for instance. Lastly, Inspire and Defiance are strictly for allies. One might say this sacrifice was necessary to make it more efficient and practical. Others might say the loss of identity turned her into any other burst mage, and both are correct to some extent. Creating abilities with powerful effects, such as what she has right now, that apply to friend and or foe is a massive undertaking without making the base forms abysmal. Lulu's dual purpose abilities are kept in check by the fact that she can only use it for one or the other, never both at the same time. Karma, on the other hand, was able to do both at the same time, which is why she was so underwhelming without the usage of Mantra. Presently, Inner Flame, Focus Resolve, and Inspire are strong enough without their empowered forms, but they wouldn't be if they had ally benefiting and enemy harming effects in place. The consequences of said rework did strip away her individuality, no one can deny that. She feels like a very generic mage support in the same vein as like Lux, Morgana, etc., whereas before she had a very distinct personal identity, but it did wonders for her popularity and lifetime. Karma's rework made her hyper-consistent, and her omnipresence ever since was target for debate as to whether or not her all-purpose usefulness and long list of constant balance changes would often be used against her as proof that she was fine before even if she was underwhelming. Could there have been an alternate timeline where she maintained her old iteration and they just worked off of that? Absolutely, but personally speaking, Karma's rework set a valuable precedent for future visual gameplay adjustments. Remember, she was Riot's first major overhaul, or at the very least, she set the trend for how reworks were carried out. They wanted to focus on preserving the champion's core experience, that was their priority, and of the two, Duality and Mantra, Mantra definitely carried more weight, so they kept that and discarded the ally-enemy interaction in favor of more healthy and viable gameplay. Thanks to her, Riot wasn't shackled by respect for the original. They could be as ambitious as they wanted to, keeping only the things that worked and removing everything else that didn't. They were able to turn Galio, an awkward mage bruiser, into a strong anti-magic warden. They transformed Scion from this jank-ass point-and-click stun bot to this gargantuan dreadnought of a raid boss. They give us Poppy, Shen, Warwick, Urgot, so many fantastic reworks because they only cared about preserving the most important thing in that champion. Eventually, it did result in them being a little too lax in their boundaries, which is what led to Irelia and Akali, but up until that point, I would say Karma's rework, despite losing much of her original identity, was an overall positive change going forward, not just for her, but for so many others. If you guys enjoyed the video, it would be awesome if you gave it a like and subscribe. Consider following me on Twitter, joining my Discord server, and checking out my previous retrospectives if you haven't yet. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.